So thanks for coming to my presentation. It's on psychochemical weapons. So we've all heard of chemical weapons, right? These were initially banned by the Geneva Protocol, not the Geneva Convention, that was some 20 years later. The Geneva Protocol happened 7 years after the end of World War I because that war featured the use of some pretty inhumane gases, namely mustard gas. And there it explicitly banned the use of asphyxiating, poisonous or other gases and bacteriological methods. But notably, something that was not officially, verboten by the convention was the stockpiling and research of chemical weapons. And it did not specifically mention pharmaceutical agents by name. That came some more than 70 years afterwards with the Chemical Weapons Convention, and this required the destruction of all existing stockpiles and explicitly named pharmaceutical agents. But that's a lot of time in between those two conventions in which it was somewhat implied that the use of pharmaceutical agents and by virtue psychochemical weapons could be permitted. And that's mainly a time period we're going to be talking about here. So unlike traditional chemical weapons, psychochemical weapons have little confirmed use in large-scale warfare. They do have a history of covert, often unethical, and largely unsanctioned experimentation during the Cold War period. I think MKUltra is probably the most well-known of these experiments. Most people know about it by the psychic driving experiments. Mostly what is thought of when we think about MKUltra, and it was a big focus of the program. But there was also a chemical division to MKUltra whose research goals included several psycho-weapon concepts in the form of goals for developing certain drugs. Of these included demotivating agents, disease-mimicking drugs, and suggestibility enhancers, which basically makes you more manipulatable. Some of these objectives are highlighted on the side here, and I went and further divided some more striking ones by defensive and offensive characteristics. But you can see that they went well beyond, or they wanted to go well beyond, a knockout pill. Some of the more striking ones here, though, are things like drugs which can enhance the ability to withstand privation and torture, produce symptoms of recognized diseases for malingering. And on the offensive side, you have things, substances which can produce illogical thinking. One very perhaps unethical objective was a substance which could be administered in drinking water at very small quantities to lower the ambition of men. Those objectives are known, but the true extent of the drug research into them is not. Most documents were destroyed in 1973. They were disproportionately about the drug research. Of the content that did get out, it was so heinous and inhumane that if the priority was on destroying this particular drug research, we could only imagine what was going on. The documents that were destroyed included records of 150 sub-projects dealing disproportionately with psychochemical weapons. I also want to touch on the Soviet Union at the same time. The Soviet Union, now Russia, has been comparatively slow to declassify documents. It's perhaps a bit idealist to think that they were not investigating similar things at the time. But internal documents do show that their program seemed to have been reactionary to the American program, that they may not have actually had investigations of this sort prior to learning of intelligence that MKUltra was going on. Most of their documents, though, focus on this psychic driving concept, which did not necessarily use drugs. But in this document that I found, which was published by a Russian historian, and they do mention psychotropics, which are drugs that affect the mind. So it's possible that the Soviet Union did entertain similar concepts, but the true extent to which is not known. After the official decommissioning of MKUltra, there was another example of psychochemical weapons being developed on the national level. This was from South Africa during the apartheid government, who launched a program called Project Coast. This program was engaged in the creation of potential crowd control agents. It's known for entertaining very unconventional agents, notably methaqualone and MDMA, but of course also cannabis and LSD. For those who are unaware, methaqualone is a hypnosedative drug that is capable of producing a profound state of sedation. It's paradoxically, though, liable for seizures at high doses, and it was withdrawn from global markets in the 1980s because it caused widespread abuse. For those who have this drug at the tip of your mind, but you're not so sure where you've heard about it from, it was mentioned in The Wolf of Wall Street as the preferred drug of the protagonist. And I only mention this because I've had a few people tell me MDMA, I don't think needs an introduction, but it's a substituted amphetamine known for its empathogen and technogenic effects. These are two agents that are pretty strange for crowd control measures. Perhaps methaqualone less, but MDMA doesn't quite make sense for something like that. It seems that the initial motivation of the program was to develop psychoactive gases and gels for crowd control, but they failed to develop a gaseous and cannabinoid, and there was limited success of a mortar-delivered methaqualone gel. It's not entirely clear if they were able to get it to aerosolize. On the right here, I mentioned a report from the commission which looked into this, and it seemed that they had some initial success, but they were looking into more potent alternatives. Despite testament otherwise, though, and this is quite interesting, there was a trial for this, and the defense made quite a point that MDMA was also being weaponized. There was no evidence of testing, and it was known well before it was ever part of the program that it was entirely infeasible. Naturally, it was pertinent to look into why this was even included in the program. And it may be true that at certain points in the program, there was a transition from defensive crowd control to offensive methods of population control. The Dr. Wouter Basson, head of Project Coast, who's actually still practicing in South Africa today. He was head of Project Coast, and the Delta G scientist, which was the company that was entirely a front company for this program, noted he observed that methaqualone was used in combination with cannabis in the Western Cape. Large quantities of methaqualone and MDMA were sold in the black market as pills by Basson. It's possible that later intentions, maybe individually from Basson himself or the program, sought to fuel drug use within the African youth. There's another quote from the report which was striking to me, where a scientist talks about the idea that if one were to consider what happened in Vietnam, the Viet Cong giving psychoactive drugs to American soldiers as psychochemical warfare, which officially it is not, it would be considered quite successful. American drug use during Vietnam was extensive with drugs like not only cannabis but heroin. So it's possible that the objective of Project Coast, at least in the later phases, was similar to this initiative in a way that may make it easier to justify legislative or otherwise actions of the apartheid government against the African majority at the time. Agent BZ, which is a chemical weapon with potent anticholinergic effects. It was investigated by the US Army and alleged to have been used in the Vietnam War, but it was decommissioned due to variable effects and a long onset time. In addition to the long onset time, it had a ridiculous duration of 3 days. Mind you, this induces a state of delirium, manifests with hallucinations that are not entirely apparent to the individual as fake, because the faculties to detect that are also impaired, which makes them especially cruel weapons. The use of a quote-unquote sleeping gas by Russian special forces during the Ost-Nord siege in 2002. This resulted in the deaths of all 40 hostage takers, but also 132 of 912 hostages. A case was raised at the European Court of Human Rights in 2011 to investigate Russia's use of this weapon, to understand whether or not this was in violation of the prior chemical weapons treaty and, of course, human rights. They did rule that it was a violation to the right to life because they had haphazardly used a gas with the real risk that it would kill hostages. But the use of the gas itself was not considered a violation. Chemical Warfare Commission designated that pharmaceutical agents should not be used in warfare in a weaponized fashion, but judicial precedent also modifies how these things play out. So it's quite interesting to see that it was not considered a violation because for all intents and purposes, given that a 2012 study identified that they'd use carfentanil and remifentanil, which are two forms of fentanyl utilized in anesthesia, these are psychotropic drugs that of course induce their lethal effect through respiratory depression, and in that way can be considered more chemical weapons. But they perhaps do open up a possibility to legally use overt psychotropic agents under the Chemical Warfare Commission. In talking of the limited examples of psychochemical warfare, it makes you wonder, why are they really not that common? It's taken quite a bit of research to present these examples, and of course, while they are unethical, inhumane, and heinous, and they were in one case used at a sizable scale, why is it the case that they don't seem to be all that much of a threat, especially with regards to terrorism? Well, it's possible that the capability is limited mostly to national governments or militaries due to the cost of research, the equipment needed to synthesize, and the chemical traceability especially. The precursors needed to synthesize some of these chemicals are tightly controlled, and to acquire amounts large enough might not be feasible for terrorist organizations that would entertain such an attack. And then the complexity of weaponization at scale. It can also be said that we do encounter psychochemical weapons on a smaller scale. Drug-facilitated crimes arguably make use of these weapons in a way that is analogous to one of the objectives of MKUltra, which is a knockout pill administered in food or drink that can provide maximum amnesia. Drugs like Rohypnol, more commonly known as roofies, have been used in a way that arguably is use of a psychochemical weapon. And I wanted to finish off with some ethical questions. Before I had researched this, my opinion was that psychochemical weapons are entirely impermissible. But as we learned in the example of the haphazard use of the Russian special forces in hostage rescue, would it perhaps be permissible to use psychochemical weapons for such if it were used in a more targeted way? Ultimately, if that intervention would have been successful and more discreet, it would have had the potential to save the hostages in a way that caused much less risk. But of course, that example was not that. And then applications in counterterrorism, where it may be preferable or safer on a population scale than other weapons. You also have to keep in mind that weapons in these cases will likely be used. And then also, should certain psychochemical classes be entirely impermissible? The Chemical Warfare Commission only seemed to make a blanket ban on pharmaceutical agents, which doesn't seem to have held in judicial context. So would it be more sensible to ban weapons that are more agreeably inhumane